It's so easy to go into denial about peak oil because it changes everything. Every one of us has grown up during this unique historical period when we've had easy access to cheap energy and all of the things that cheap energy can do for us. And so even people who intellectually understand peak oil, as soon as they turn their attention away, almost immediately start to go into sort of their normal mode of thinking. It's a natural human response. I find myself doing it all the time. And, I spend hours every day studying peak oil from all sorts of different standpoints. As soon as I turn my attention away, suddenly I'm in the normal world again, the so-called normal world, the consensus trance that we all live in on a daily basis.
In the rich world, in the industrial world, in the English-speaking world, I see almost zero likelihood that the majority is going to actively embrace this anytime soon. But nonetheless, because of the geological imperative of this, something or other will happen, whether people like it or not.
We are almost absolutely, totally dependent on oil for all of our activities. First of all, industry, of course, runs on oil. Everyone understands that. Agriculture, modern mechanized agriculture to feed the world, is heavily dependent on oil. If you look at transportation, again, it's obvious, cars and planes run on oil, petroleum, gasoline. And of course, military capability. You cannot fight a war, as the Americans know, without oil. So every aspect of human existence is dependent on oil. And when we reach that point, when we get to maximum production, maximum supply capacity relative to demand, that is a very significant point, which many people think, including me, is without precedent in human history.
Global oil production will peak. The global economy will be devastated by it. We'll see oil wars. Everything will change as a consequence. And yet people won't be talking about the oil peak. They'll be talking about the unemployment figures. They'll be talking about the high price of food. They'll be talking about the fact that you can't get on an airliner and travel anymore because all of the airline industry has collapsed. There are only a few carriers still in business and the tickets are astronomically expensive. They'll be talking about the latest war or terrorist incident, and they will have completely lost sight of the one event that caused all of those effects.
I think the evidence for peak oil is absolutely overwhelming. First of all, we're discovering less and less new oil fields. Virtually 4/5 of the oil that we're now consuming comes from fields discovered before 1970. The opportunity to find new oil becomes limited to smaller and smaller pockets, which are more difficult to extract and more costly. We are now consuming each year 3 times more than the extra oil that we're discovering. And that gap is widening. But the key point is, I think, really this. At the moment, the world is using about 84 million barrels a day. Opinion in the oil industry is that we could perhaps, at an absolute limit, push that to around 95 million barrels a day. I don't think you'll find anyone in the oil industry itself, let alone outside it, who thinks we could do better than that.
There's something like 53 countries now are physically producing less today than they have at some point in the historical past. I mean, that's fact. That's not interpretation or anything. Of course, you could, if it's just reached peak, you may say that's an anomaly. It may be able to do a little bit better next year, but by and large, most countries are either past peak or going over it. Britain, for example, peaked in 1999. Norway has also now gone over the top, as the Norwegian government confirms, and it's falling fast, about 6% a year. So that means the world is pretty much close to peak of ordinary conventional oil. then there's another surge of this deep water oil, the last frontier, so to speak. There's a little surge of that coming in probably. And then, of course, there's the heavy oils of Canada and Venezuela that come in. There's a huge resource. There's no shortage of it, but the extraction rate is extremely slow and expensive. So if you put the whole thing together, I think we have a peak around 210.
I think the general consensus, probably within the oil industry itself, although they're very unwilling to say this publicly, but the academic researchers, who are much more likely to be independent and hard-headed in their analysis outside the oil industry, believe that peak oil probably in the area of a 2010, 2015, something like that. And after that, we begin to see a gradual, very slow, gradual reduction in the supply, but an acceleration of demand. That's why this is not alarmist. It is impossible to believe that that will not happen. It is going to happen.
Also, there's so much debate about this date of peak. It really misses the point to a degree, because whether the peak came last year, this year, or in 10 years' time doesn't really make that much difference, because it's not a high peak, it's only the maximum of a rather gentle curve. And the real impact of all of that, which is beginning to be realized, is not the peak itself, but the vision of the long decline that follows peak. And that's a relentless, remorseless decline that goes on forever at 2 or 3% a year. It's not individually very much, but that eats into our supply very seriously and ever worse.
We expend about 10 calories of fossil fuel energy for every calorie of food energy that we produce. Now, this would have been impossible in any earlier historical time before we had access to cheap oil. If we had been expending more energy to grow food in the medieval era than the food gave us, we would starve. It's only because of this one-time only gift from nature of fossil fuels that were created over millions of years and stored up, and that we have been drawing down over the course of just a couple of hundred years, that we're able to run these energy deficits in our food system. So we're enormously exposed in that area, and peak oil could in fact mean widespread hunger and even famine on a global scale if we don't prepare for it and begin to transform our global food system to one that is not so dependent on fossil fuels.
So I think it's a great illusion for people to think, oh yes, we've been through this, we faced it in the 1970s and we got out of it. We sort of got out of it. You could argue that we made a right mess of getting out of it and got ourselves into a much worse fix, and we should have listened to some of the signals from the Earth and so forth, but we clearly didn't. This time it's going to be different. And I think that's going to be rather a stark realization for people. And I think people for a long time are going to be thinking, oh, we got out of the 1930s, we got out of the 1970s, what's going wrong? Why can't we get out of it now using the same kind of techniques? And I think using the same kind of techniques, at least some of the similar techniques, would be a great mistake, although I've no doubt that's what's going to be tried, unfortunately. There's a very strong relationship between economic growth and energy growth, particularly between growth of electricity demand and also of oil demand. And one of the reasons is that as the economy grows, we nearly always transport more stuff, people drive to more places, they fly to more places, more tourism, more everything, more food comes from far distant places. We're basically moving more molecules faster to more places in greater quantity, and all of this moving of molecules takes a great deal of energy, and most of that energy is oil.
And this is where peak oil comes in, because the implication of peak oil is that oil prices are going to become more volatile, and that the average price of oil is going to remain structurally higher than it has in decades. And if that happens, then the economic value securing this American debt structure has got to be valued downwards by some factor. Let's call it X. And factor X is the thing that threatens the United States most.
What happens if, especially your key energy feedstock, which is oil, what happens if that goes into decline? And it seems to many of us analyzing this that it's unavoidable, the conclusion is unavoidable, that economic contraction will be the result of this. I've not seen any convincing evidence that will not be so.
The economy is really kept afloat by the confidence of investors and consumers that economic growth is going to continue. If there's a widespread perception that the economy is going to contract, people will stop taking out new loans. People will stop buying new houses. Investors will stop investing. And the consequence of that is that the economy will begin to shrink. If the economy is not continually growing, that means new loans aren't being taken out, and new loans are the means by which the money supply expands. Money is created through the making of loans. So if more money isn't being created, that means that not enough money will exist to pay back existing loans at interest. That means there will be foreclosures, and when that happens, money effectively starts to disappear from the economy.
The decline itself is not really a serious crisis, but as the financial community wakes up that the growth is no longer possible, and this decline has not only started, but it's going on, it's not just a little downturn, it's a beginning of a new age, that this could cause quite a shock. I mean, it could cause resource wars for people to try and get access to what is left. It could, I think personally, it probably heralds the second Great Depression, that somehow they've got to wipe out just mountains of capital.
Irrespective of the peak itself, I think there'll be such a gap between the available supply and the desire, if you like, the demand, that it'll already cause huge trouble. Now that may coincide with the peak and that may not. So that will be a very interesting period of time to look at in terms of public reaction. And I mean, once you start seeing gas lines, once you see petrol stations, gasoline stations running out of gasoline, once you start seeing trucks on American roads and on European roads just broken down and run out of diesel on the side of the road, not having made their deliveries, supermarket shelves going empty, once you start seeing that kind of thing, it's going to be very, very difficult for opinion leaders, for the media, for politicians, for corporate executives. It's going to be very difficult for them to spin a tale which explains that without actually admitting that actually the reason is that we're at peak oil and we're facing decline.
Not that they don't know. I mean, governments are extremely well briefed. Their leading officials make sure that they're in contact with all the leading organizations in the country, particularly sort of business and certainly the oil industry, which is so important. They will have talked exhaustively about this. So it's not as though they don't know, and it's not as though the leaders are not briefed. Of course they are.
If you're a politician in a country that matters, and you say, I've got a concern about oil depletion, what's your next sentence? What do you say after that? You've essentially just said, the world as you know it is going to end. End of, and that's all we have today. I mean, you really have to be able to follow up with some sense of some policy, some solution, because there really is no easy solution at hand. Politicians are really loath to get into the whole notion of depletion. You can't raise a problem unless you've got a solution at hand. I mean, that's kind of the rule of politics, unless you're criticizing your opponent, and so no one really wants to raise the notion of depletion.
Of course, one would expect the politicians across the world to have begun to get together to talk about the implications and what each of them needs to do in order to deal with this threat. I suspect the reason that doesn't happen is because the United States, the far and away the most powerful country of the world, has decided that it doesn't want to convene an international conference to discuss how it's going to be shared out. What they have decided to do pretty clearly from invading Iraq and trying to control oil from the Caspian Basin, which is the second largest repository of oil that is left in the world, is to try and monopolize for themselves the supply of this oil, because oil is power.
Without cheap oil, the American empire would never have come about. Certainly as in anything like the form that we know it. Cheap oil has been absolutely critical to the construction of the political economy that is the United States today. And if you remove cheap oil, then that political economy has to change profoundly.
The mainstream media, I think, have done an abysmal job of reporting on the events of 9/11, on peak oil, and other things that really impact our lives. I mean, the average person knows much more about the personal habits of Brad Pitt than they know about peak oil and what's going to affect their life in the near future. I mean, if they don't have food to eat, if they don't have a job, that's something they need to know about beforehand. That's something they need to prepare for. And peak oil is the event of our lifetimes. It's going to dwarf anything that any of us has experienced in our lives up to this point. And yet we're told virtually nothing about it. Same thing with 9/11. I mean, here was the great political event, so-called terrorist event of our lifetimes. The world has changed profoundly as a result of it, and yet there's absolutely no real investigative reporting about it in the mainstream media. Instead, we have a lot of very courageous, independent investigative journalists who find it impossible to get their work published in the mainstream. It's a disastrous situation. I personally believe that there is a deep relationship between the events of 9/11 and peak oil, but it's not something I can prove. There's a lot of circumstantial bits and pieces that when you add them up together paint a pretty persuasive picture, I think. The CIA's been studying the phenomenon of oil peaks since the 1970s. And Dick Cheney, former CEO of Halliburton, the world's foremost oil services company, has talked about the difficulty that the oil industry will have in meeting demand by the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Now, what happened after 9/11? Well, of course, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and used that occasion to build military bases throughout the region of Central Asia, which is the new oil production region. Lots of new oil discoveries there in, coincidentally, 2000 to 2001. And then to invade Iraq, one can't help but see a pattern here. It seems evident to me that 9/11 was in effect a kind of pretext for the U.S. to expand its military hold on the two most important oil-producing regions of the planet.
There are a number of elites, number of very influential policy advisors, a lot of people who went on to form part of the administration knew that peak oil was coming. They knew that they would not be able to survive peak oil without having this massive militarization of policy, and thirdly, that they needed to do that on the back of a drastic attack or perception of a threat in relation to the United States, and this is what 9/11 provided.
In our work, the fundamental job that we do for people is in understanding what's really going on and trying to understand what is behind events and what is motivating people. That's different from passing judgment on it. We're not trying to make value judgments. We try to eschew value judgments as much as possible, as a matter of fact, in our consulting work. We are very interested in what really happened on 9/11, is the short answer.
Well, you have four options to declare 9/11. One is it was a strike out of the blue. Nobody knew anything. It was the first version the American administration told the public. Then they knew a lot, but in different agencies, and the picture was so difficult to put together that they couldn't find out what was happening, what was in the future. And I think it has broken down, but the administration is fighting on this line. The third option is they let it happen. They knew something, or they knew the whole story and let it happen because they could use it in order to bring about war against up to 60 states, as they said later on. And the fourth version is they organized it or were part of organizing it. And the way it happened is so strange, and the unwillingness of the administration to clear up all the environment is so strong that I've finally come to the belief that it must be a steered operation, covert operation.
When I started looking through the 9/11 Commission report, I was outraged. I mean, here was a book that had shot to the top of the bestseller lists, and Americans, millions of Americans, were looking to this report, this book, to tell them what actually happened on September 11th, 2001. And they were doing so under the assumption that there had been a clear, open inquiry into the events, that all of the relevant questions had been asked and evidence had been provided. And this clearly was not the case.
Well, the Keane report on 9/11, which was finally set up, I think is not a serious examination of what happened and what the causes were. I say that, first of all, because clearly the Bush administration didn't want to do it. They resisted all the calls for an official inquiry for several months. And what actually finally persuaded them to do this was not the politicians in Congress. It was the families, the wives of those who were killed at 9/11.
The first thing it does is name the 19 hijackers, the mostly Saudi nationals. But of course, we heard within days of the events that something like 5 or 6 of these people were still alive and well and living in the Middle East. Why wasn't this addressed in the 9/11 Commission report? Why weren't why wasn't there some inquiry as to who were the real hijackers, if in fact the people who had been identified were clearly not the right people?
And on the day itself, which I think is the most significant evidence, the first plane hit at 8:46 a.m., the Southern Tower at about 9:05 a.m., the third plane hit the Pentagon at 9:38 a.m. They knew there was a hijack between 8:10 and 8:20 in the morning, let's say 8:15, so they knew half an hour before the first plane, 3/4 of an hour before the second plane, and an hour and a half before the third plane hit their targets. And not once in that time did they scramble a warplane to intercept. Now that is just staggering. When first of all they had Andrews Air Base, which is 10 miles west of Washington, with F-16s with a top speed of 1,500 miles an hour. They could have been over the scene within a minute or two. Why were none of them scrambled? And secondly, you might think, well, there was chaos, no one knew what to do, it was a catastrophe, but...
Just standard operating procedure. When a plane is off course, fighter jets are notified. Fighter jets go out to see if the plane's having a problem or just, well, what the problem is, because the plane's obviously off course. And for the year before 9/11-01, fighter jets were called out on 67 occasions. So the question is, when we knew of at least 4 planes were off course, and there's words that it was even up to 11. But where were the fighter jets? They weren't there. Now, from our research, which people wouldn't know, we have now found out that there were 15 exercises going on that day involving all the fighter jets in the northeastern portion of the United States. What are the odds of that occurring? Like 0? I mean, or 100%. I mean, 100% they couldn't occur without a fix being in.
Why had these towers fallen so quickly, these steel-framed towers? No steel-framed buildings had ever collapsed before because of fire. Why wasn't there a proper inquiry? I think something like $600,000 was spent to investigate why the Twin Towers collapsed. Meanwhile, something like $52 million were spent to investigate whether Bill Clinton had had an affair. This is absurd.
There's been many fires in many buildings before and even after. And I think in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I'm from, right outside of Philadelphia, there was the Meridian building fire and smoke throughout the building. Several firemen were killed in that fire. Building didn't fall down. Buildings don't fall down, never did before, never did after. A prime example is what occurred in February of 2005. A 45, 50-story building in Madrid, Spain, burned out of control, wildfires. It was on all the TV shows and networks. The building was totally gutted. Still stood afterwards. Still stood there. Taking it down, I witnessed it myself. They're taking it down now, steel beam by steel beam. Concrete and steel buildings do not fall down from fires. I know it's hard for people to believe, but it's our position that they came down because they were imploded or explosives occurred. Fact is, building number 7, across the street from the North and South Tower, had some fires in it, but no plane hit it. At 5:20 in the afternoon, the owner of the building, Larry Silverstein, receives a phone call from the fire department saying they can't put out the fire. So he said, pull the building. Pull the building means implode the building.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
And it came down in its own footprint. That's significant because the North and South Tower also came down in their own footprint. That's also significant because the remnants of Building 7 was pulverized material. The remnants of the North and South Tower was pulverized material. In the basement of Building 7, they found molten steel at 1,500 degrees. In the basement of the North and South Tower, they found molten steel at 1,500 degrees. 1 and 1 still equal 2 as far as I'm concerned. And that's a fact that people can take a look at.
When thermite is used to cut steel, it leaves behind molten iron. And 2 scientists, engineers who were at the World Trade Center in the weeks after 9/11 reported seeing massive amounts of molten iron. And I found out that there was pools of molten steel found in the basement of the World Trade Center when they finally scraped down to that level. So that indicates that temperatures of a very high degree were reached through the use of thermite. Now what happened is that the steel was taken, and the federal government oversaw this. There were 4 companies involved in the cleanup. They took the steel to a dump on Staten Island, and then it was promptly cut up and sent to places like Korea, China, and India, where it was promptly melted down. This is the largest destruction of evidence from a crime scene in history.
I don't know how many people within governments have second thoughts. I think the Secret Services know quite well, and they have the professionals finding out that this can't happen like the American administration is telling the public. There are experts around which would agree with dissent. But to put it up and to bring it into the operational level for governments, it's very difficult because the American administration is fighting like hell against anybody who is doubting about their version of things.
One can see the story just being massaged to where it's consistent with itself, not necessarily consistent with the facts or with previous testimony, but so that it's internally consistent, so that it becomes the new myth that Americans and the rest of the people around the world presumably believe about 9/11. In fact, we still do not know what happened that day. We don't know who was behind it. And that has enormous implications for our understanding of what's going on in the world today.
The use of conspiracy theory as a derogatory, as an epithet almost, is something that propagandists have perfected over the decades, and it's a useful tool for eliminating articulate dissent and other points of view and information that might be inconvenient for a policy agenda.
I think it's very much part of the political culture it's ingrained in us that the idea that our leaders could ever commit atrocities against our own civilians is so morally horrifying. We just can't believe it. And I think that this really goes back to the way our culture has developed over the years. The idea that Western civilization has ingrained in it certain moral categories that prevent us from doing any certain kinds of acts.
People don't want to believe it occurred, but we have to go back in history. People in Germany didn't believe what was taking place in the 1930s and 1940s. Jewish people did not believe what was taking place throughout Europe. People in the United States didn't want to accept what was taking place back then. So we should look back in history and realize that events like this have taken place, and we better put up our safeguards now before it's too late. A lot of the people in the anti-war movement want nothing to do with 9/11. Well, ladies and gentlemen, wake up. If you didn't have 9/11, you wouldn't have the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
I think the main aim of the Bush administration is broken down or written down in the project of a new American century. They say we have to fight against at least 60 states harboring terrorism, mostly in the near where oil is situated or gas. In order to bring the support for this war, this is necessary to have this international new terrorism.
Much of the planning for the war on terror preceded 9/11, and you can really see the extent to which there was a desperation on the part of government leaders in the West, not just in the United States, as regards the impending crisis posed by peak oil. There are a number of studies which show that they have been aware of the peak oil crisis for a while. So the idea was that American foreign policy would be reinvigorated with energy policy, and the two would be combined. And it mentions the Middle East, it mentions the Persian Gulf, and it mentions Iraq.
This is very much not so much a war against terrorism. It's a war to secure control over distribution. And in that sense, it is absolutely no different whatsoever than the Rockefellers' move to control the North American oil industry in the late 19th century, which was not so much a move to control the pumping of oil and the extraction of oil. Rockefeller's genius was in seeing that if you could control distribution, you could control the industry. And the same is true today, extrapolated through the global market.
And the advantage of an American takeover of Iraq is that you get immediately physical control of the second largest deposit of oil that is left. Secondly, you are on the doorstep if anything happens in Saudi. And by having American bases, which already exist, of course, in Saudi and in Kuwait, and if we now have a string of American bases, which is what I think will happen in Iraq, you then have control of the Middle East. But that is what it is really all about. And I think the Americans, in order to do this, in order to extend their power, in order to explain to the world something which is more acceptable and that the Americans want to control the rest of the oil that is left, they needed some kind of facade, some kind of explanation, some kind of rationale. And for that, the enemy, after the fall of Soviet Russia with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, they needed a new enemy, and very conveniently the Islamic threat became that new enemy.
But the question we have to ask is, stepping back, how far have those people either been funded or trained by the CIA and MI6 in the past or even now? And how far the actions of the British and the Americans in the Middle East have created the circumstances in which people will become involved in those organizations?
It's a clash of civilization. This is the theme which has been brought up in the beginning of the 90s. Sam Huntington told us we have to have new enemies. We have otherwise Western societies will not be able to lead. So you see this idea behind all this. And I don't believe in Osama bin Laden. I don't believe in Al Qaeda. I think it's all brought up by continuous faking of intelligence and propaganda.
So the notion of a U.S. war on terrorism is simply a fraud. There is no war on terrorism. The Anglo-Americans are backing terrorists exactly when and where it suits them, from Chechnya to Cuba to other points around the world.
The bulk of my research in my book, The War on Truth, concerns the role of Al-Qaeda as an instrument of Western covert operations. And this really does, for me, fundamentally undermine the entire concept of the war on terror, the entire view that they've given us of 9/11 and what happened. Because if Al-Qaeda is an instrument of covert operations rather than an enemy of the West, then there is no war on terror. And this is really the crux of the issue.
This is a typical British strategy. You've got to know the name of Brigadier General Sir Frank Kitson. He was the British operations officer in Kenya at the time of the Mau Mau. And what Kitson saw, which has been known to commanders for centuries, millennia, if you've got an underground nationalist organization and you want to discredit them, you create your own parallel underground nationalist organization. You send them out. It's got to have the same name. It's got to have a false flag. You send them out, have it commit tremendous atrocities. Those will be blamed on the original relatively benign group, and they'll be discredited, they'll be demonized, and you gain political advantage. He wrote a book about it called Low Intensity Operations. And the technique is called the technique of the counter gang or the pseudo gang. Just as Al-Qaeda, in the broader sense, is a pseudo-gang or counter-gang created by US and British and Israeli intelligence. It's a counter-gang against normal Arab nationalists or anybody with any positive agenda for reform or independence or development anywhere in the Arab world. They can always be labeled Al-Qaeda. The reductio ad absurdum of this is President Chavez of Venezuela, after giving Bush a hard time at various conferences and doing things to undermine the dollar. The neocons are now accusing President Chavez of being a member of Al-Qaeda. So you can see how easy it is to demonize somebody once you've got a good counter-gang going.
It's now been documented beyond a doubt, based on historical records, that the CIA, the MI6, teamed up with very, very secretive parallel elements of European intelligence services and orchestrated terrorist attacks to mobilize the public against the left, against the communists, and so on and so forth. And this would be really shocking to people if they knew that this is what happened. And this is what happened. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the best book on it is Daniel Ganser's book, NATO's Secret Armies. So this is serious academic stuff.
there's an oligarchical consensus in the United States, inspired by the neocons, inspired by Samuel Huntington and the rest of them, which is that without an enemy image, you cannot have an oligarchical society. Ultimately, that's the why. Because if you look at this, you say, terrorism, endless war, why? Who benefits? Those who benefit are the beneficiaries of the current system, financiers primarily. They feel that without the diversion of a war, they cannot maintain social relations, property relations in the current form. And this they are determined to do. So they have manufactured, in a complete hysteria, a largely fictitious external enemy. You remember 1984 by George Orwell. Julia at one point says, I don't even think there is a war. It's just a fake to keep people under control. Orwell, I think, had a very good understanding of some of these psychological mechanisms.
It's absolutely clear to me that a conscious decision has been made by the highest elements of our governments to allow and proliferate a terrorist threat. And this justifies the absolute wholesale militarization of policy, not just in terms of foreign policy, but at home, in the crushing of civil liberties, the criminalization of dissent, the introduction of draconian terrorist legislation, which only allows governments to have even more powers against free speech and against public mobilization. So this is really the function that Al Qaeda plays. It plays a fundamentally functional role in a myriad ways, fueling covert operations, securing oil and gas interests quite directly, and indirectly generating the justification and the ideological framework necessary to legitimize this whole insanely repressive structure of violence that we have today, called the war on terror, which is really just a gigantic lie. This has been fabricated for this purpose.
When the economic impacts of peak oil take hold, there's going to be very high unemployment. And when countries descend into that kind of economic turmoil, there is social unrest, almost always as a consequence. I mean, look back to the 1930s. There was real concern throughout corporate America that the United States might fall to a communist government. Now, I think in the U.S., following peak oil, there likewise will probably be considerable social unrest. And I think the Patriot Act is a way of preemptively dealing with that unrest.
This is a pattern that goes back many, many, many decades. And the involvement of military intelligence, the involvement of the CIA and these organizations within the borders of the United States is something that is amply documented in scholarly work, and you don't have to be a radical to observe it.
The U.S. leaders are putting in place an infrastructure whereby they will be able to deal with that unrest and at the same time channel it towards scapegoats on the other side of the world. I'm sure that we'll be told that the reason we don't have enough oil is that there are evil people somewhere who are keeping it from us, who have perhaps attacked oil rigs or sunk tankers or battleships in the Persian Gulf or something like that. And therefore, we just have to go over there and deal with that problem. And once we've done that, of course, the American way of life can continue as it was before. Of course, that's a lie. The American way of life is effectively finished. It can't continue past the time of peak oil. Everything must change to adapt to the reality of a much lower energy world. But that's not the kind of message that Americans are going to want to hear. And so I think that there's a very high possibility of the United States becoming a kind of fascistic sort of regime. And I desperately hate to see that happen. But if one just looks at the signs on the horizon, they all point in that direction.
Now, obviously, we're not at the route. We're not as far down that route towards dictatorship as the Nazis were. But we are going, I used to say we're going slowly towards it. We're not now. We're going rapidly towards it. So the reason we have to stand up and convince people that 9/11 was in fact an inside job was to stop that kind of Nazification taking place, particularly in Britain and America. And the time to do it is not to think about it and worry about it and think, well, I might be convinced by this if I read a bit more in a few years' time. The time to do it is now. Don't give them the benefit of the doubt. Because if we don't do it now, in 4 or 5 years' time, the apparatus of democracy will not be there for us to change our circumstances. So it's really either now or never.
When you see Bush defend his Iraq policy, you will see that he does not use Iraq arguments in terms of closing the deal. When it comes to the heart of the matter, he uses 9/11 arguments. If he's asked, why did 2,000 people have to die in Iraq for no reason? The answer is 9/11, the lessons of 9/11. I know it's hard, but these are the lessons of 9/11. With that kind of demagogy, he's able to keep a hard core of 30 to 35% of the American public. With 30 to 35%, he will be able to stay in office and wage war indefinitely. He'll be able to go for a wider war. He can manufacture new 9/11s to firm up that base. He and Cheney can provoke incidents that will lead to war with Iran, with Syria, with Venezuela, with North Korea. There's no limit to this. It has no bounds. The only way to begin to attrit and to erode and to break up his 30 to 35% base is to begin dismantling the myth of September 11th.
Because without accurate information, without an accurate understanding of the world, you cannot have a functional democracy. If people don't know what's going on, and if people don't understand what their leaders are doing, there's no democracy.
This is the biggest problem, because as long as the American people are so susceptible to propaganda through the television and the mass media, I really can't see how they will get themselves out of the predicament that they're in.
Denial is actually, it's the default condition. We all live in it continually, and it takes a deliberate effort to stick your head up above that state of denial and catch a breath of fresh air and really see what's going on.